Year 12, hope you've all had a lovely half-term break and enjoyed this beautiful weather that we've been having. So this is Tuesday's psychology lesson and Wednesday's. So in terms of the video, it's all one. Obviously, stop and start it as and when. It is obvious in the PowerPoint on the shared screen when one lesson ends and the other one begins. Okay, so your retrieval for this lesson is this. I want you to just literally retrieve what you can. So this is just before the half-term break on the cognitive explanation of depression. So we know when we're looking at depression in this psychopathology topic that we just have to apply the cognitive lens. So what are the cognitive theories and ideas and concepts for why somebody might suffer from depression? As much as you can. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so this is just a checklist really for you to compare your what you managed to retrieve against. So did you remember to talk about Ellis and his ABC model? So we've got two key names, haven't we? We've got Ellis and we've got Beck. So Beck's negative triad or cognitive triad and Ellis's ABC model. Did you refer to this idea of irrational thinking? Because that, of course, underpins the whole of the cognitive explanation for any disorder, that there must be something irrational or faulty about your thought processes, about your cognitions. You might have gone even further and remembered to talk about specifically cognitive biases. So, for example, magnification, you magnify the negatives, you focus in on anything bad that happens. Linking to Beck's negative triad, you might have remembered this concept of the negative self-schema. We know schemas are so central to the cognitive explanation, don't we? And you have a schema about everything, including yourself. And if your self-schema is negative, if you have negative thoughts about yourself and your worth and your how liked you are, then that will mean Beck says you are vulnerable to depression. So linking that idea of schema to the idea of Beck's negative or cognitive triad. And you might have remembered this idea that if you are depressed, you've got this cognitive vulnerability and you have selective attention. You will only focus on certain things. And if you have got this negative way of thinking, you'll always focus on the negative. You might have remembered that Stroop test that we talked about. So I included on that slide with your checklist, this is actually an exam question. It's only 2 marks and you just had to fill in the A and the B. But it's just a reminder really of Beck's negative triad. So of course the answers were it's negative views about yourself, negative views about the future, and negative views about the world. And Beck said if you have that type of negative thinking, that's the triad that leads you to develop depression. So remember, with the cognitive explanation, the thinking comes first and the depression is the result of that. So the cognitive processes are there, and if they are negative, that's what leads, or irrational, that's what leads you to have the depression. And that's a really important assumption that we're thinking about when we apply it to depression. Okay, so you know what to do if you're looking at your sheet and you're thinking, I didn't have any of those things. You go back, you could re-watch the video, you re-look at your notes, you test yourself, you look at the flashcards, and you make sure you're strong on the foundations of the cognitive explanation before you move on. We're going to do a little bit of application to play around with this knowledge, get it back fresh in our minds. And then in this lesson, in the Tuesday lesson, we're moving on to evaluate and say, okay, so how good is this explanation for depression? But first, let's apply some of that knowledge. And I'm going to use the visualizer now and kind of do a bit of a modeled example with you so you can see what might be expected. So what we've got here is outline at least 2 ways in which a cognitive psychologist might explain depression in a person who's recently become unemployed. So first thing, I think is really important, this idea of a cognitive psychologist, excuse my hand in the way, that will throw some students. They'll think, oh God, is that like a therapist? Is that, oh no, I don't know about treatments. I don't know about what psychologists do. A cognitive psychologist is just anybody who, in the area of psychology, in the area of research, who takes the cognitive approach. So we're just thinking with our cognitive hats on. That's all we need to do. Okay, so that retrieval task you just did, all of those ideas should then be buzzing in your mind as soon as you see that term cognitive psychologist. Okay, how might they explain depression in a person who's recently become unemployed? Now, it's telling me two. Now, if I went and I thought about that idea and I took that step back, and actually I'll do so, I'll go back and I'll go to that retrieval checklist and I'll say two big things, two big areas for me to talk about in terms of a cognitive explanation for depression. Well, I'm going to go Beck and Ellis, because Beck and Ellis is going to allow me to have two really great hooks to answer this question. So when I see at least two, I'm going to go Ellis, and I know his is the ABC model. Don't worry about trying to read my dreadful writing. I've got this typed up on the next slide. I might need something to lean on, actually. This is like really, this table's a bit dodgy. And Beck, cognitive triad or negative triad. So those are my two things, and that's how I'm going to structure my answer. Because there's only 4 marks, I'm going to get 2 marks for each one that I do. So I've already got my focus. But what's really important, because I'm applying my knowledge, it's got to be about somebody who's recently become unemployed. So anything I want to talk about, I've got to hook and link onto that. So I'm going to start with Ellis. Ellis's ABC model. Now I remind myself and I say, what was Ellis's ABC model all about? And I say it was activating event, which can happen to everybody. It does. That's just life. Events happen. The beliefs that I hold, that's all of my thinking. That's the cognitive bit. And how they then influence the consequence. The C is my consequence. So in somebody with depression, my consequence is the depression, the symptoms that I'm seeing. My beliefs must be their negative thinking or their irrational thinking. Now, I'm looking back, I'm thinking, right, so what's this got to do with being made employed? Being made employed is your activating event. Somebody with perfectly rational thinking is made unemployed, and yes, it's a massive blow, and it probably causes them high anxiety levels because they're worrying about paying the bills or when another job is going to come along, but it won't necessarily cause them to go into a state of depression. Ellis's ABC model tells us the A is the activating event, being made unemployed. It's the beliefs that you already hold. You've already got some irrational thinking going on there, some cognitive vulnerability, and that's what leads you into your depression. So we need to then unpick that a bit further. Even though we don't have to write a massive amount, I think the process of thinking this through properly is useful. What sort of irrational beliefs might somebody have? What cognitive biases that might lead them to go into this state of depression, having been made unemployed? Well, it could be irrational beliefs and negative beliefs about themselves. So I'm useless anyway. I'll never get another job. Thinking about the future. Or it could be some of those things like catastrophizing that we looked at, those examples of negative irrational beliefs, where one bad thing has happened. In this case, you've been made unemployed, you've catastrophized it, everything's a disaster. Nobody's going to like me anymore, I've lost my job. I must be totally useless. I'll never get another job. It's all my fault. And that kind of example of irrational thinking would come into my answer as well. So I'm going to run with Ellis, and I'm going to say the being unemployed is my activating event, and that's led to the consequence of depression because I've got irrational thinking, and I'm going to focus on just one example, because remember, I'm only getting 2 marks for this entire thing, and I'm going to say catastrophizing. Okay, lovely. I've linked it to the question. I'm focusing on the idea of being unemployed. I've got Ellis's name in there. I've shown the examiner. I understand this is a cognitive explanation. Great. Let's do Beck then. Beck's a bit easier, I think. Beck tells us it's your negative triad that's causing depression. So it's your thinking about yourself, the world, the future. So we might pick one element of that. And I might say negative triad. I think I'm going to look at self, and I'm going to think about this idea of self-schema. I've become unemployed. If I've got negative thinking about myself, I'm going to go, yeah, well, I'm useless, I'm worthless, nobody's going to want to re-employ me. I've got no hope. No wonder they sacked me. I'm not good enough. I was never good enough for the job. I've got all these negative thoughts about myself, these negative self-schema going on, and that, when I've been made unemployed, sends me into that state of depression. So I'm going to pick up on Beck. I'm going to talk about the negative triad, in particular thoughts about myself, and I'm going to make it relevant to the idea of being made unemployed. No one would want to employ me. And I'm actually, in my answer, going to give an example of that sort of negative thought about myself. Okay? That's the planning stage, really. And obviously, in the real exam, you would be so confident in all of this knowledge. Your schema on the cognitive explanation for depression would be so strong that you'd be able to just fluently put that down on paper without all of this detailed planning process. But it would be vital that you did that little self-check. Have I linked it to the application question? Have I talked about the idea of being unemployed? Okay, so let's have a look. I pre-typed it because I knew that my writing on the sheet of paper would be no use to anybody. So got your two elements. We've got Beck's cognitive triad. I did it the other way around on here. So being made unemployed will affect your feelings of self-worth and your self-esteem. You might start to develop, or you might have already had, a negative self-schema, which makes you feel as though you're not valued. This negative self-belief may in turn affect your thoughts about your future, and Beck would argue that the negative cognitive triad is the cause of depression. So I've got Beck, cognitive triad, makes it relevant to unemployment. The same with Ellis. Ellis's ABC model explains that someone who has a cognitive vulnerability, so what's going on in there makes you vulnerable to depression due to their negative and irrational thinking. So I'm focusing more on the irrational thinking now. They'll react to an activating event such as being made unemployed with depression. They already have beliefs about them not being valued or being stupid, that negative self-schema again, and this activating event then triggers it. Or, like I said, when I was planning it, thinking it through, we might pick up on something like catastrophizing. There's loads of different options, but bring in Ellis, bring in Beck, we're focusing on the issue of unemployed, then we get the marks. Okay? So, there's a few other examples of questions of that nature in your revision packs that you can be dipping in and out of and having a go at applying that technique. I'm not going to set one explicitly here because there's another task to follow a bit later on. But, just for self-checking, for testing yourself, keep using those revision packs. So I said we'd move on and we'd start evaluating. We're going to evaluate how useful, how good, how well supported is the cognitive explanation of depression. Before I go and share some good evidence and some key points with you, I want you to have a go. First of all, can you remember what the acronym DOOR frame stands for? Can you remember our evaluation toolkit? I hope so. I'm sure you can. And then, thinking through what we've done so far on the cognitive explanation of depression, have a go at just putting a couple of sentences down for each of the highlighted elements. I've left out free will, animals, and methodology because it's not particularly relevant here. And remember, even in a 16-mark question, we're only looking for 3 to 4 evaluation paragraphs. So we'll only ever need to use 3 or 4 elements of DOOR frame. We never need it all. Okay? So just have a go. Pause the video, have a try at that. So I know there's a lot on here and I'm in the way of it, but it's so that you've got it. You can print this out from the PowerPoint that I've shared on Sims engagement, and I'll just pick out a few of the key things. But this is essentially the task I just set you, and it'll be useful to compare what you managed, what you came up with to this. So there's a few key things that I've highlighted, and they're the things I'll focus on here. Determinism. Now, generally, when we're talking about the cognitive explanation of anything, we say it is deterministic, but it's what we call soft determinism rather than hard determinism. So it's a bit of a midway point. And it's deterministic because it says that the way our brain processes things is determined. We're born with it. It's like the pre-wiring, really. We can't really, stop that or change that. But it does recognize that we can change our thinking. We're going to look at treatments next lesson, and one of the ways we can change our thinking is through treatment like CBT, in a way that we can't change our genetics. So it's not as deterministic as, say, a biological explanation. So it's a bit deterministic because your thought processes and the way that brain is like the processing unit of a computer, that's already determined, but it's not totally, because there is an element of being able to change and control your thinking. Other evidence, I've given a couple of examples. These are in the online textbook. And interestingly, they focus on this idea of cognitive vulnerability. So looking at women and assessing them for their cognitive vulnerability to depression in terms of their irrational thinking, their sense of self, and so on, going back to Ellis and Beck's ideas. Then looking at the relationship between those with a high cognitive vulnerability of depression, and then in those women when they have their babies, how many of them suffered postnatal depression. And actually there's quite a strong correlation. And there's been other further studies as well by Beck and Clark that tell us actually you can almost see, before they show symptoms of depression, you can almost see who might develop depression based on their cognitions, based on that vulnerability. So there's quite a bit of supporting evidence. So that's what we can talk about with our other evidence. Nature nurture is an interesting one, that overemphasis. Because I suppose linking back to that deterministic bit, we could say it's nature, because the way your brain processes things is determined by your nature. You're born with that brain. That's the way it's always going to be. But it doesn't do that too much, because it does also recognise the role of nurture. It recognises the role of those activating events. If we use Ellis's ABC model, and everybody's activating events are different, that's part of your upbringing, that's your background, that's your nurture. And there's also some evidence that suggests, from a different approach, that actually if you don't form those secure attachments as an infant, then you are more likely to develop depression. And the cognitive explanation doesn't really tell us why that might be. That's more of a behavioural nurture explanation. So I'd say for nature nurture, it's not too over-reliant on nature. It does recognise a small role that nurture plays in terms of those activating events, but it's not complex enough or thorough enough to explain things like that link between early attachment and depression. So you could use that as a bit of a strength and a bit of a weakness, and that's always good when you're evaluating. Reductionist, well, yes, we talk about machine reductionism, because the cognitive approach is always trying to compare the human brain to a machine. Well, human brains might work like machines, but there's an awful lot more to being a human being, isn't there? Such as emotion. And this is where the cognitive explanation of depression falls foul as well. Because if we look at depression and we go back to think about those different symptoms of depression, there's a real variety. Everyone thinks it's just feeling really low. But in some patients with depression, it's much more about anger and aggression. Well, those are emotions, and the cognitive explanation doesn't really account for that. So we could say it's reductionist, because it reduces it just to a simple matter of processing and thinking. But depression might be more than that. The cognitive approach tells us that cognition's thoughts come first and emotions are the result of that. There's no evidence, there's no proof of that. We have never studied emotions enough to really be able to say that with certainty, that the thinking comes first. We don't know that. One thing I thought you'd be interested in, and I've highlighted it there, and I've got a couple of video links on the next slide, is Cotard syndrome. Now, this is not a form of depression, but we sometimes see it in severely depressed patients. So what we're talking about here is comorbidity, when you've got more than one disorder. And this is why any explanation it's always going to be reductionist, because these disorders are so complex and often people have more than one thing going on. Cotard syndrome is fascinating. Essentially, it's a form of psychosis where you imagine you are dead. So you think now you're living, you're talking, you're moving, but that's because you're almost like a zombie. You have died. Okay, I've got a video clip. I'll show you in a minute. Real life applications, that's when we bring in the treatments and we say, yes, this explanation, this cognitive explanation for depression has had real life application. It is useful. It's led to CBT, which we're going to look at in our treatments lesson. But CBT is the most commonly used form of treatment. So that gets people back to work, which contributes to the economy. That has real life application. And then ethics. How ethical is it to say that if you are depressed, it's all because of your thinking and you can easily change your own thinking? Well, it places all the blame on you. So we could say that's slightly unethical, but what it also does is it suggests that if you change your thinking, that's all that needs to happen. But sometimes somebody is depressed because of the circumstances they're in, abuse, extreme poverty, horrendous situations. And telling somebody that if they just change their thinking, then they'll be able to get out of that state, it might be quite demotivating, because really somebody needs to change those circumstances and they often need help to do that. So there's a bit of an ethical question, because this does put all of the blame onto the person and their way of thinking. And sometimes there are deep-rooted reasons why somebody goes into that state of depression. So mine's probably more detailed than what you managed to come up with in the short space of time I gave you, but I'm sure you've got the key elements, and hopefully you're just getting back to grips with applying that door frame evaluation toolkit. Keep that, print it out if you can, make sure, because that will be useful when we're looking at more extended questions and when you're revising. You could turn that into some flashcards. I'll prompt you for that at the end. Okay, now you might think, why is Miss showing us this again? What's this got to do with what we're talking about? But I just want to give you that historical context again. You've seen this before. It's generally speaking our approach is timeline, and so we can see kind of where things fitted in. Well, we know that the cognitive approach wasn't until the 50s, the 60s, we started talking about cognitive neuroscience. We started talking about the computer analogy model of the brain. So we're quite late on. And the work of people like Ellis and Beck, which was very much happening around that time, will have been shaped and influenced by the people that came before them. But their key differences, cognitions come first. So emotions, behaviors, all these other things, they are the result of your thinking. And that's where they totally differed from what had come before them in terms of the behavioral approach and even the biological approach. Okay, so remember, you keep it in context, the historical context of psychology, really important. Okay, I said there were a couple of video clips, so shut me up, pause this, and just click on the pictures in your PowerPoint. This first one, this guy's talking to us about that Covard syndrome, that zombie believing that you're dead. Quite interesting. It's only a couple of minutes. And the other one, again, thinking about something that often happens alongside depression. Not often, actually. I shouldn't say that. This is a very rare disorder, this postpartum psychosis. But what I mean to say is that where we see postpartum psychosis, we often see it with somebody who also has depression. So comorbidity, when you have more than one disorder at the same time. The purpose of watching these video clips and just familiarising yourself with these two quite unique disorders is because it shows you how complex it would be to work with a patient with depression. And therefore it shows you why any explanation, whether it be cognitive or behavioural or biological on its own, is always going to be reductionist, because it can't possibly consider the complexity of these sorts of syndromes and this comorbidity. It also tells us why it's so difficult to diagnose and define disorders. Okay, so pause me and watch those two clips. So that concludes Tuesday's lesson. Prompts for creating flashcards. You might have a flashcard with 3 strengths of the cognitive explanation and 3 weaknesses. And to do that, you would very much use that handout there that I've kind of given you. Okay? So stop the video, come back to me and forward to trying to work out how many minutes I'm in. I'm not sure. You'll have to just skip through because I'm about to begin Wednesday's lesson. Okay? So here we are, Wednesday psychology lesson. You might be watching this just all the way through from Tuesday, if you can stand that much, all in one go, or you might be coming at it afresh. But make sure you are doing it in a logical sequence and you've done Tuesday's lesson, because otherwise this one's going to make no sense. Okay? Just before we plow on, most of you have already accepted it. That's brilliant. But make sure you've checked your emails and you've accepted the invite to attend the live lesson. How exciting. On Thursday at 12 o'clock, where it can just be a bit more interactive, and I can use it as an opportunity to review things and go through things, and you can ask me questions, because I'm very nervous if just keep ploughing on if you're at home going, Miss, we've no idea. So just please make sure you accept that and join in on Thursday. Okay, so retrieval for this lesson. We are thinking about treatments. And so just a bit of an image prompt, really. What can you retrieve? What can you remember from those 4 image prompts? Okay, we're thinking about treatments. Off you go. Okay, so whether you pause me or just had a quick check, let's have a look. So the first one, this is obviously, well, I say obviously, might not be that obvious. This is showing us biological treatments. This is showing us what drugs do. Now, we'll come on to this in more detail when we look at OCD, which is our final disorder that we have to look at as part of this topic, because we do that from the biological approach. But this diagram should be at least familiar to you, because when we did the biological approach, we talked about this, and we talked about the role of these tiny little circles here, the neurotransmitters, and that if we have too little of certain neurotransmitters like serotonin, it causes us to suffer from things like depression. So what do? We give somebody drug treatment. We give them drugs which will change the levels of their neurotransmitters. So we have drug treatment, commonly used. Hopefully this pyramid shape prompted your memory on the behavioural treatment for phobias, systematic desensitization. Remember your anxiety hierarchy? Do you remember my worked example of rats? Yeah, the thing that you are most afraid of at the top, step it down gradually. Systematic desensitization. Token economy, which is used not just as a treatment actually, but generally to get people to behave how we want them to behave. But we sometimes use it for people who have maybe antisocial aspects of their behavior. We give them rewards when they behave positively. And then flooding. I know it's a bit of a naff image to have used, but we know again that's a behavioural treatment for phobias. But instead of it being gradual, it's intense, it's throwing them in at the deep end and exposing them to extreme levels of the thing that they are afraid of. Okay, so quick recap on treatments there. Today's lesson is focusing on treatments, but obviously cognitive treatments for depression, because we're sticking with our cognitive depression. So a couple of terms that I'm going to be using and that you'll get used to seeing, which might be useful for a little flashcard or to create your little glossary. So we're going to be looking at the cognitive behavioural therapy. There are 2 strands to that. There's cognitive therapy, which comes from Beck's ideas, and then there's rational emotive behavioural therapy, or REBT, which comes from Ellis's idea. So we're going to be unpacking both of those. Key element to both of them is homework. So we're going to be thinking about the strategies, the actual activities that therapists use, and one of them is homework. And we're going to be thinking about going back to Ellis's ABC model and adding a D and an E. So you'll see all of that will become clear, but that might be a useful little reference point, some key terms for your glossary. Okay, so cognitive behavioural therapy. Now the clue is in the name. It is a cognitive therapy. Cognitive comes first, but there are behavioural elements to it. So immediately when we're thinking about evaluating, we're thinking, oh, okay, this is good. It accepts both the cognitive and the behavioural elements. This is the most commonly used treatment for a mental health problem. So if you are referred for any mental health problem, it's highly likely they will prescribe you or they will recommend you for a course of CBT. Some of you may have had it. Okay, so it's really commonly used, especially in younger people, because they would rather you do CBT before they prescribe you drugs for things like depression. They'd rather you do this rather than prescribe you antidepressants. So, cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's two different types. And the two different types links us back to our two key people for the cognitive explanation, Beck and Ellis. Okay, which is why it's so important we're securing our knowledge of them. So Beck talked about, we know, the negative triad. So we're going to be thinking about, if the problem is negative thinking about yourself, the world, the future, then what can we do to change that? That's Beck's cognitive therapy. And then we're going to be thinking about Ellis's ABC model and saying, well, if when you experience an activating event, your irrational beliefs and your irrational thinking causes you to have that unhealthy response of depression, what can we do to change that irrational thinking, to dispute those irrational thoughts, to stop you having that same depressed consequence? So that's the basis of it. And what's really important when you're answering a question about cognitive treatment is you always link the treatment to the explanation of depression. So this is the problem, therefore this is the treatment. And that's what I've tried to do in this explanation here. So if we go back to Beck and we remember Beck's negative triad, views of the world, views of the future, and views of yourself. And if you think negatively about those things, that's when you are likely to suffer from depression. Well, if that's the problem, what's the solution? Well, Beck said, simple, we need to challenge the negative thinking. You're thinking negatively, that's causing you to suffer from depression. Let's change that. And some of that will literally be through direct discussion. So the therapist and the patient will sit down, they would talk about their thinking, let's say views about themselves. Oh, well, I feel like I'm worthless. I feel like nobody needs me. The therapist would actually, in an environment of kind of warmth and trust and respect, unpick that and challenge it and talk to them about, well, that's not true, but what about this? Think about the role that you have in that friendship, in that job, and they would unpick it. But far more powerful than that is the homework task that the therapist would set them. And we refer to this as reality testing, because what the therapist would get them to do in between the sessions, send them away and get them to do some homework, they would ask them to record things that allow them to challenge their negative thoughts. So let's imagine they think they're worthless and nobody needs them. Their homework task for the week would be to record every time somebody needed them for something. And the therapist would set them up with lots of examples. So if you were needed to help somebody with a problem at work, if you were needed to respond to an email, if you were needed to help a friend out who was upset or needed you to do something for them, all of these different things, you'd have to record them all, because that allows you to challenge your own negative thinking. And that's way more powerful than someone else just telling you, no, what you're saying is wrong. And then you can come back to that, and the therapist would come back to that. So then if in a future session the patient says, and I'm worthless, they say, oh, hold on a minute, get back those recorded notes from that homework task. Look at all those things you did in that week, or that other people said to you in that week, that showed you are not worthless. So it's called reality testing. And that homework element is a really important element of Beck's cognitive therapy, and also Ellis's REBT that we're going to see in a minute. Okay, so that's one strand of cognitive behavioral therapy. The steps I've kind of referred to briefly there, but it's quite important